There's a romantic tragedy in the cliche of heroes who fight for their beliefs for too long until those very beliefs erode into villainy. It's a trope we've seen time and time again in movies, books, games, and anime. And yet, it never gets old. Because there's something gripping, almost poetic, about watching someone fall. But there's nothing poetic at all when you're this guy. Once upon a time, Fadli Zon was the voice of the people. Loud, defiant, allergic to tyranny. And fast forward a couple of decades and suddenly, mass rape in 1998? Can't confirm that. You either die a hero or live long enough to gaslight an entire generation. He fought the new order, just to cosplay as it years later. Turns out, some villains don't rise. They recycle. And history, it's easier to deny when you think the victims won't vote. Indonesia is set on revising its history, allocating 9 billion Indonesian rupiahs to revise historical records. However, Indonesian Cultural Affairs Minister Fadli Zon is facing renewed public backlash for downplaying the well-documented mass rape of Indonesians of Chinese descent during the May 1998 protests in a public interview with IDN Times. Now, before I continue, let me provide some context for viewers who aren't familiar with a bit of Indonesian history. 1998 was a seriously horrendous time to be an Indonesian, especially when you're a Chinese Indonesian. At the time, Indonesia was still under the corrupt dictatorship of my guy Suharto right here and was struggling financially. The Indonesians blamed the Chinese Indonesians for the crash, not realizing it was actually caused by Indonesians overborrowing massive amounts of US dollars through reckless crony loans because they assumed the rupiahs would stay stable until investors panicked and pulled their money out of Indonesia after watching the collapse of the Thai baht triggered by George Soros short-selling the Thai currency, which then caused the Indonesian banking system to implode, leading to mass withdrawals by the public and skyrocketing inflation across the country. Out of that equation, where exactly does the Chinese Indonesians come in? Of course, none. Because the root behind the discrimination comes from an old business practice called Alibaba, which was coined by Indonesian Minister of Economy Iskak Cokrohadi Suryo in 1954. The name policy came from the Muslim name Ali to denote a native Indonesian, while Baba was used to denote Peranakan Chinese. So, what is the Alibaba practice? It's the practice of having a native Indonesian frontman and a Chinese Indonesian operator. The practice comes due to the affirmative action policies that prioritize granting import license to native Indonesians, who often lack the experience to run businesses, necessitating a Chindo bro to come in and help out, teaching them businesses. The practice soon came to its head as it started the entirety of the Indonesian power brokering system. The government grants license to native Indonesians, who in turn sells these licenses to Chindo businessmen and allows monopoly as long as they split profits, leading to many Chinese Indonesian conglomerates to dominate the 1990s Indonesia. The Chindo businesses thrive under Suharto's patronage system, with some like Sudono Salim to go back with Suharto in 1950s, where the Alibaba practice emerged, creating the impression that the Chinese Indonesians were more richer than the native Indonesian. At the time, the Chinese Indonesians were overrepresented by figures such as Salim, James Riyadi, and Eka Ciptawijaya, living like crazy rich Asians. While in reality, there were so many Chinese Indonesians who were also poor and middle class. When 1998 crashed, mass violence against the Chinese Indonesians and their businesses broke out, and many of these crazy rich Chinese Indonesians fled to Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, while the average Chinese Indonesians suffer most of the violence. Most victims and family of victims still seek justice till this day. Enough with the history lesson, and now returning to Fadli Zon and his catastrophic fumble. I honestly think that Fadli Zon denying the sexual violence that happened in 1998 or downplaying it isn't a good reflection of the history that he's rewriting. And I know some people say that 9 billion rupiahs is a small amount of money, and I'm like, dumbass! With that amount of money, you can build 15 public schools, 4 years tuition, for 1,000 university students and free mental health care for the entirety of Java for a year, which we need to cope with bullshit government programs and policies like the ones you're doing, Fadli. And many people still feel strongly over the events that transpired 27 years ago. You can't deny that the event is still holed up in living memory. And to deny these atrocities happened, even after President Habibie's own fact-finding team confirmed that yes, violence and rape did occur during the 1998 riots, is disgraceful. Imagine surviving the worst moment of your life, only to be told decades later by your government, the same government you voted for, probably, I don't know, that it never happened. That's not just denial, that's just cold-blooded ignorance. It also doesn't help that throughout Fadli Zon's tenure in politics, he has been caught using non-PC language, using semantics such as quote-unquote them when referring to the Chinese Indonesians. At this point, Fadli sounds more and more like a bitter Discord racist gamer than a minister.
Hey, monkey, you got to be kidding me.
And while yes, there are many arguments that could save his ass from allegations of racism because apparently he was against Papuan racism, racism is a selective bias. You can be racist towards a certain race, but not all the races. And not even a week after he said what he said, bro doubled down on a press conference by saying that continued usage of the word man is going to dismiss. And not even a week after he said what he said, bro doubled down on a press conference by saying that continued usage of the word mass is going to besmirch the good name of the Indonesian nation. And that there has never been conclusive reports or investigation that only provides numbers of cases but not the investigation process. Bro, there were plenty of investigations, both public and private, conducted by the government and its citizens. And even a 17-year-old was murdered after she wanted to publish her investigations to the United Nations. Fadli Zon, go read a f***ing book, man. Oh my God. Go read a book. I swear to God, if you visit his house, and you go to his study and you just see a book cabinet, it's stuffed with 100 copies of Prabowo's book, Kepemimpinan Militer. It's literally the only thing he reads. But yeah, Fadli Zon runs us into the risk of disintegration and providing an existential threat to many Indonesian boys, ruining their chances of looking for the Chindo baddies everywhere. Why did I add this inside the script? Let's get back into the serious page though. Fadli Zon's argument hinges on the absence of direct public testimony, suggesting that because no victims of the 1998 mass rapes have come forward by name, the event itself is questionable. This line of reasoning is not only flawed but deeply irresponsible. In post-convict societies, especially in cultures where sexual violence is heavily stigmatized, victims often remain silent out of fear or shame or lack of legal protection or even silenced. Moreover, the Tim Gabungan Pencari Fakta, a government-backed fact-finding team formed under President B.J. Habibie, officially acknowledged that rape and sexual violence occurred, stating that systematic acts of violence against Chinese Indonesians took place during the riots, including sexual assault. The evidence exists, but the victims have been met with institutional silence, coercion, and even worse, assassination. To reduce historical truth to a demand for courtroom-style witness testimony ignores how trauma and fear operate, and how the state itself failed to create the conditions where survivors could safely speak. Even more concerning is Fadli Zon's tone and delivery as a public official tasked with cultural preservation. Rather than approaching the topic with empathy, historical rigor, or acknowledgement of lived pain, his statements come across as cold, dismissive, intellectually unserious. This matters, not just because of the content of his denial, but because of the platform from which it's delivered. As Minister of Culture, his words are not private opinions. They shape national discourse and memory. They're the reflection of the fucking government of Prabowo's administration. Historical denialism from someone in his position risks legitimizing misinformation, fueling ethnic tensions, and undermining decades of work by survivors, scholars, and civil society organizations. When a sitting minister publicly questions one of the darkest and best documented episodes of Indonesia's democratic transition, despite government investigation, human rights reports, and survivor testimonies, it becomes clear that we're not just dealing with ignorance. It's fair to suggest that we're dealing with a state-sponsored attempt to rewrite history under the guise of revision. However, Fadli Zon is not an outlier. He's a byproduct of a system that has long refused to confront its own violent past. Since the fall of Suharto in 1998, Indonesia has made surface-level democratic reforms, but has largely avoided a full reckoning with the atrocities committed under the new order. Key military figures implicated in human rights abuses remain politically influential. Efforts towards transitional justice, including reparations, public trials, or state acknowledgement of wrongdoing, have either been stalled or quietly buried. In this context, Fadli's denialism isn't so much shocking, it's actually very predictable. It reflects a broader political culture in which historical accountability is optional, and where officials are often rewarded, not pushed, for undermining uncomfortable truths. When figures like Fadli publicly question the events of 1998, they're not merely misinformed. They're reenacting a state tradition of selective memory, one that prioritizes national stability over justice and narrative control over historical honesty. If left unchallenged, this culture risks breeding future leaders who see historical erasure not as a moral failure, but as political strategy. Indonesia stands at a crossroads, and our reckoning with 1998 will define whether we lean into division or progress. Take, for example, Joko Anwar's latest film, Pengepungan di Bukit Duri, which imagines a 2027 Indonesia where a targeted siege unmasks the deep scars of anti-Chinese sentiment, and does so with brutal honesty. It's a reminder that our collective nightmares aren't buried, they're just waiting. Meanwhile, a new generation of Chinese Indonesians is coming of age, upbeat, tech-savvy, outwardly thriving, yet still grappling with what it truly means to belong, to be Indonesian in every sense of the word. They crave a society where heritage doesn't become a scapegoat, where their identity isn't questioned by fear-driven politics, and where cultural pluralism isn't just aspirational, it's lived. If Indonesia is to become that inclusive nation, then confronting the truth of 1998 isn't optional, it's foundational. Fadli Zon's denialism isn't just an insult to history, it's a warning. Without accountability, we normalize the erasure of trauma, we validate selective amnesia, and we risk repeating the same sins under new names. The stories we refuse to acknowledge today will shape the generations of tomorrow. Let our shared history remind us. A modern Indonesia is only possible if we choose memory over amnesia, truth over convenience. But hey, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, am I right? Unity in diversity, as long as you don't ask too many questions about the bodies buried underneath it.
Subscribe to the Based Indonesian Show. Dijamin halal